Welcome back to the Intrinsically Ordered Podcast. Today we're going to be talking about religious trauma, identity after leaving or deconstructing religion, queer identity, and more. Today I'm joined by SC Neely, who is an expert in religious trauma, owns a therapy practice dedicated specifically to queer and trans individuals, author of 30-plus books, and we're going to be walking through a roadmap of understanding and thinking through religious trauma and identity. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited.
Like I had said before, a lot of my audience is in the spot where they're coming from a high-demand background of Catholicism. Their identity and rules about the world are sort of given, and as they question and might realize that they're queer or might be starting to figure out, do I want to be a different religion? Do I not want to be religious? How do I do this thing? There's so many different emotions and things that people are thinking through. Could you give us a quick crash course on what religious trauma is and maybe some of the biggest misconceptions on it?
Sure, absolutely. So religious trauma can come in a lot of different forms. Like there's a ongoing list. You could really pick anything, but the basic concept of it is any event, relationship, person, experience, organization, etc., that is somehow obviously connected to a religious or spiritual belief system that causes the individual to feel any sort of traumatic response to that. So that would look like overwhelming and disruptive experiences that have adverse effects to physical, mental, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. And so it's not to necessarily say it's about like the religious beliefs itself, but it's more about the experience in it or with the people in it or the organizational structure and the impact that has on the individual. So what is traumatic to one person isn't necessarily traumatic to another, even if it's the same situation, but it's really more about how it impacts that individual and helping them to unpack it for themselves.
Yeah, I found a lot of people there's a lot of people who love their religion and who might see other people unpacking trauma around it, and they go, I had a great experience, or these things are true, or like, what's this whole thing about?
Well,
I like your point that it's about individuals' different experiences, right? You might have, even in the same religion, in the same city, two different churches with two radically different experiences. If somebody is thinking through, do I have religious trauma? What does that look like? Could you give us a little bit more information on what are the signs and symptoms that somebody might have had a traumatic experience with religion?
Sure. Yeah. It is such an individualized thing to each person. And I definitely, when people hear that I work with religious trauma or that I specialize in religious trauma, a very common response I get is that they assume I'm anti-religion or anti-spirituality or anti any of that. And I'm not. I'm anti-trauma, right? And so that's what I'm more so working on. And I tend to view religious trauma through the lens of a complex like PTSD type of diagnosis. And so a lot of the symptoms that somebody might experience, I think, line up a lot with PTSD, specifically complex PTSD. And so what that can look like is any sort of dysfunction that's occurring mentally, cognitively, in their affect, in their emotional state and well-being, their ability to function like a day-to-day setting, their relationships socially with other people or culturally, as well as things like developmental delays or anything like that. Anything that you might see as a symptom of PTSD, you can kind of put the same symptoms into that category of religious trauma.
And it's a lot to deal with, and I've found it. Like in my day-to-day life now, 2 or 3 years after deconstructing, it doesn't affect me a lot. But if I start going back to churches,
Sure.
like I notice my heart rate rises a little bit. If I'm listening to somebody talk about religion, I have so many thoughts in my own background and in theology, like my brain starts going on hyperdrive, thinking about all these different angles and like analyzing things. And I was going back to a church with friends the other day and noticing that, and I was like, oh, that's a sign that my body's like keeping track of what's happening and has a thought or two about what that background was that other people, like if I go to a different religious service, nothing like that happens. It's specifically like Christianity. It's also different in how it sort of manifests.
Yeah, it's definitely really interesting. And it also always surprises me. Actually, this morning, I was at orientation for my daughter's school and I ran into a member of a church that I'd formerly been in before I came out as gay and I was no longer welcome there. And I had a big reaction just like physically in my body to seeing her. Like I hadn't expected her to be there. And I was like, oh wow, yep, that still impacts me years later. It's still there for sure. It doesn't necessarily go away. There's a lot of ways to, of course, unpack it and work with a therapist to really help, you regain that functioning and to desensitize it a little bit. But, the thoughts and feelings and experiences you have are going to remain there and valid.
In your own clinical experience, how do you see sort of queer experience or queer identity compound with religious trauma?
Well, there are obviously the rare cases of queer folks out there who didn't grow up around religion and it wasn't a part of it. But unfortunately, at least for a lot of what I deal with, there is just a huge overlap in, if your family was religious or if you grew up around religion or in religious settings, and then you later kind of figured out, started to put the pieces together that, hey, maybe you're gay or you're trans or gender diverse or something else. You really then have to figure out the identity piece of everything, right? Because you most likely then something in that religion, most religions have some thoughts about sexual orientation or gender diversity. And now you have to unpack how does that play with you in your life. So like for me personally, I grew up in a very evangelical conservative cult here in Virginia, in Southern Virginia. And I was in it for a very long time until the cult disbanded, as cults do when you have like infighting among narcissistic leaders. And but the belief systems, right, of like how the family should look, how a relationship should look, were so intrinsically in me at that point, right? Like I was raised as a girl and I wasn't allowed to wear pants. I wasn't allowed to cut my hair, and I had to learn like how to sew and cook and make sure I could become a great wife one day and all of those things. And so learning that as a very young child, it's in my like bones at that point, right? Of like, this is what it's supposed to look like. And now in my 30s, as a queer identifying gender fluid person, what a relationship looks like, what my romantic partnership looks like is incredibly different, right? And it doesn't fit that narrative at all. But it took me a long time to unpack, okay, well, what is my identity now? Not even just in terms of a label, but like, how do I have a family or a partnership or any of those things when what was modeled for me was very, very specifically one thing? And so a lot of clients I work with have that similar experience of, one, there's untackling like, is it okay that my identity is either frowned upon or actively considered sinful based on whatever religion you're coming from? Mm-hmm. And then once you're able to work through that, it's recreating, okay, well, what does that mean, right? I don't have any models for that. I was modeled with a nuclear husband, wife, 2 kids model, right? So what does that even mean? How do I do that? How do I find fulfillment in a relationship that will look nothing like what I was told it would look like? And so that's a lot of work for people, for anyone really, to unpack and then rebuild, right? There's a lot of like, we talk a lot about deconstructing, but we don't talk as much about rebuilding afterwards. Yeah, we can deconstruct everything, but then you have to go through the process of building yourself up from the ground up. That's a lot of work. So that's a big part for me.
In talking to some of my guests, it seems like there's sort of 2 camps that can really cause trauma, where there's sort of people that visibly look different in a religious community. Like I think of in the group that I was a part of, that women had a lot higher expectations on modesty and sexuality. Mm-hmm. Or I was talking to a friend who's a woman of color in one of these spaces, and it's like, then you have racism because you stick out in a certain sense. And there's also some of the more, the identities that make you feel invisible. Like with my own experience being a cis gay man, it was like, people never really picked up on that. Or I've talked to some women that will, they've gone on birth control for health reasons, and they're worried that that'll always be found out. Mm-hmm. Do you notice sort of how religious trauma can affect people that are visibly different in spaces and persecuted, and people who sort of are erased in a certain sense? Do those manifest differently or together? Or is there sort of like a third category? That's just one observation that I've had as sort of an untrained guy on the internet.
I think it's both, right? That it's more of an and versus an or, because yeah. If you are visibly in an othered identity, then you have to deal with that backlash, right? And you have to deal with what that looks like and how it might put stress or tension on relationships or your ability to be within that organization or system. And so that is really difficult for sure. If it's an invisible thing, then you still have the piece where you're hiding it, right? You still have the anxiety around being found out. But there's also an additional element of like a lot of high demand, high control religions, which is those are the types of religions that tend to lead to more of the trauma responses from people, do require invisible identities, right? Like your only identity, if you are a true follower, is to be a follower of Christ or follower of that church or follower of whatever it is, right? You're not supposed to, you're not allowed to, you're not encouraged to. In fact, you're discouraged from having any personal identity of your own. So any of your actual identities are supposed to be invisible. Those are supposed to come below others, right? Like the principle of third, I am third, right? So it's God, others, and then self. Like you're not supposed to have any sort of identity you're proud of or sharing. Like it's not about that. It's about serving God, serving others, right? And so there's also that aspect of like, even if it's invisible, coming to terms with, do I even feel comfortable sharing it? Is that okay to share it? Or if you leave it invisible, there's almost an aspect of like, that's how it's supposed to be. It's not about me. And trying to come up with, how do you get comfortable taking up space, right? Like I do a lot of group therapy. I love group therapy. I actually lead a religious trauma group 2 or 3 times a year. That's 12 weeks long. And the reason why I find that to be a particularly healing space for religious trauma specifically is that your first group is usually your family, or in religious settings, it's your church community. And what is broken in groups can be healed in groups. And so when we create a new group together where people are either deconstructing or rebuilding together, it's incredibly powerful. And I think that aspect of being able to take up space within a group, a new group, a healthy group, is something that most people deconstructing or on that journey or somewhere or just questioning have to learn to figure out. How do I take up space? How do I feel safe doing so? How do I feel comfortable doing so without shame?
In diving into sort of an outline of how people can work through these things, I found that some people at the beginning stages of questioning their sexuality or gender or religion altogether will often tell me stories of how they have these sort of these queer experiences or feelings, and they're so afraid to use a label. And I've had some people say, if I ever fall to temptation and watch porn online, it's gay porn, but like I'm not that, like it's not that I'm into it, or people describe I'm a woman and like I admire the beauty in women and sometimes have crushes, but like that couldn't mean that I'm really like having some sort of lesbian experience here or same-sex attraction.
Oh.
How do you talk to somebody who's in that space where they're sort of leaning towards questioning, but they're so far from even an identity or even like admitting it? How should somebody work through that and think through that if they're listening?
I think that a lot of that is a pressure to have like labels in general. And that kind of comes out, not to like be on a soapbox. So that kind of comes out of like a capitalistic type of society, right? Is like, it's a lot easier within capitalism and the structures that America is built on to put people in boxes and label people, right? It's more easy to control people that way. It's more easy to lead people that way, right? If you can just put a label on everybody. And you're gonna hear gatekeeping and or shaming around labels on all sides, right? Like within the queer community itself, there's so much like either gatekeeping of you can't use that whatever label because you've had sex with a man once, so you can't call yourself a lesbian, or you can't, be this or be that, or I was just reading an article of like someone saying that the word queer is erasure of different specific identities, right? So it's like it happens on all sides, whether you're within the queer community or not. Everyone has an opinion on what your label should be. And in the end, I think the question I would ask like a client is, what do you need that label for right now? Like, why do you need it right now? And what would it do for you? If it's something that feels really validating and really good for you right now, fantastic, let's go with it. But like, otherwise, is it something you feel you have to prove to somebody? Is it something you feel you need to have in order to legitimize what you're experiencing? Or is it something you're afraid of because you're worried you're taking up space within an identity that's not yours, right? Like I hear that a lot, particularly with people who are multisexual or bisexual. they are like, well, I'm in a straight passing relationships. I can't, it's not fair to like be in that queer space. I don't want to take it from other people. And I'm like, this is not a pie. There's so much to go around. Like you're not taking anything from anyone by being yourself.
And I found some people have this fear that if they admit an experience or attraction or a sense of dysphoria, that they have to know like what this means for their life and what to do about it. And sometimes you just have to, like, if somebody's listening, you just have to go, oh, that was an experience or attraction or a moment or whatever it is. And like you can admit that without having everything figured out or knowing what to do about everything. Like you can you can admit what's happening and still have it be confusing is sort of a it sounds so simple, but I remember my own experience of talking to people now that like that can be a big weight off of somebody's chest. It's like, yeah, maybe things change in the future and you don't know what to do about this and all of this. You can just breathe and admit sort of your lived experience of all of this.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think lived experience, the practice that I've built, it's a group practice here in the DC area called LGBT plus Counseling Collaborative. And everyone on staff has lived experience in the queer community or gender diversity in some way. And we found that the safety and immediate recognition and understanding that happens when clients come in who either are questioning or already are comfortable in a certain label or identity, when they're with a therapist that has more understanding, as in like lived experience with it, things go so much smoother, quicker, safer. It just feels so, so incredibly good. And I also like built that for myself, right? Like I come to work every day and I'm around queer people all the time, and I go home and all my friends are queer, and it's like it takes me a little time before I like accidentally run into a straight person, to be honest. I've really curated my life pretty great. So
Hmm.
it's really that lived experience matters a lot, and it's going to be so different for every single person.
On top of sort of sexual and gender identity, high control religion has a lot to say about our identities and how we go through the world.
Mhm.
Tell me a little bit about how sort of high demand experiences of religion form somebody's identity and can sort of keep them trapped in that identity.
Sure. I mean, like I said earlier, a lot of high demand, high control religions' identities are based off of service or what you provide, right? Back to that community or back to that organization, right? It's about service to God or service to others within the community or service to even, people without that are not part of the community, but are like a cause or charity that the church or the organization has taken up. And so what I've seen most often in those scenarios is that people get confused about identity as something earned versus something you are. And so that is where there's often a really big stuck point, right? And that comes with queerness too, right? Like, oh, I haven't slept with enough women, I can't call myself a lesbian, or like, right? It's like you don't have to prove or have any sort of XYZ under your belt in order to pick a label, pick an identity, or decide who you are. And I think that can be a big disservice from a lot of religious upbringings is you do have to prove yourself. You do have to prove that your faith is strong, and you have to prove it in certain ways, and you have to provide service to others, and you have to show that in order to be considered or part of the church or given the label of faithful or, whatever you want to put on it. But that piece I found comes up a lot, right? Of like, intrinsically, who am I versus what do I have to earn to be this person?
One of the lines in my own experience of Catholicism is that your experience is not your identity,
Yeah.
which is their way to get people to say, you might be attracted to men, but also like straight men who are married are attracted to people that they can't do anything with, and so like it doesn't even matter. Or like you being attracted to men on one hand like doesn't matter, it also like mega matters, but like you could never put a label on it because you're first and foremost a beloved son of the Father.
Mm.
Like you were talking about earlier with sort of that your group identity is your identity. You're not somebody who's a nurse. You're a Catholic
Mm.
who has a job as a nurse.
Yeah.
Or if you're big into a sport, it's like, no, you're not a baseball player. You're a Catholic who can worship the Lord through baseball.
Mm-hmm.
Or with queer identity, you're a beloved son of the Father who has, some issues on the side. Gives this people the sense that they can never talk or explore those experiences because it's not their identity, even though it affects their life.
Mhm.
And the one thing that I found is that, like, even if you say, your experience isn't your identity, and I like talking to Catholics where it's like, but for the rest of your life, you most likely have this continued experience. It's going to shape how you live through this particular religion. Like, that sounds like an identity to me, just with the group trying to always erase that from you.
Yeah. I absolutely agree. Yeah, you don't need any experience to decide who you are. It's just something that you feel and that you know within yourself, or you get to decide for yourself. I think that can be really, really hard. I do talk a lot in my upcoming book about identity of self and what that looks like pre-post religion, and ways to unpack that. And one of the things that comes up a lot around identity, particularly within the church, and this definitely comes up in Catholicism with saint names and things like that, is the concept of a name, right? Like our name is also really tied to our identity, and the choice of name that our family picks for us, or like saint names or things like that. All these different aspects of who we are get labeled up within our name, and not just our first name, but also our last name, right? Like of what family we come from and how that looks and where that family falls within that particular community or hierarchy within that community really has been a big piece of like identity work in terms of just your name from the very get-go.
Yeah, I've found, especially in traditional Catholic circles, where if you walk into a church, you can predict every kid's name with a sort of like bingo card of
Yeah.
10 options, because
Yeah.
parents in a traditional Catholic sense are like always wanting to name their kids just after their favorite saints. And it's no longer, my daughter, this is Therese, and then they sort of try to pigeonhole their kids into like, you are this saint now in a certain sense.
Yeah.
Or I talked to a lot of priests and sisters who are leaving religious life, and they've been known as father last name for forever, and they get to show up to a space and just be their first name without the call or without everything else is a huge breakthrough.
Yeah.
And I've talked to a lot of Catholics that will never use somebody's preferred name. Like they sort of them to never use pronouns, but like names aren't gendered and there's no Catholic teaching on it, but it's so core to somebody's identity. And you couldn't ever use gender ambiguous names or somebody's preferred name if it has anything to do with their gender, because then they could be the saint that they weren't born as. Like names, as you say that, I'm like, I'm connecting so many dots as you're saying that to Catholicism.
Yeah. There's definitely so much tie-in of like what it means and who you are and where you come from and what is expected of you for sure. And the concept of changing names, right? Like particularly right now, I don't know if you are okay with getting a little political, but with the push against trans people and right now in America and how difficult things are, like even the concept of like changing your name is so like wild and forbidden. And it's like, actually, like in Catholicism, you change your name often. Like the Pope changes his name to become Pope. Like that's like a whole thing. It happens all of the time. And yet suddenly when it's in the context of transness, it's like not acceptable. It's wild.
Yeah, one of my good friends is a trans lady, and after the Trump administration was like, we're only going off of sex assigned at birth and trying to override her passport. She was the one that ended up successfully suing the administration and getting her the correct gender marker on her passport. But it was this like, you would never guess this about her. The agent at customs would never. There's nothing good that comes out of putting an M back on her passport.
Yeah.
It's just the identity and the power control thing of the Trump administration gets to decide who you are and not you. It's just like such a wild concept.
It is. And I've run across that in smaller settings, just like within families too, right? Of like, I've seen parents who are like, I won't call you by the name that you want to be called by because that's not what's on your birth certificate, or until you change it legally, I'm not recognizing it. And it's like, that's so wild, because how many of those kids like grew up with a nickname that you picked out of nowhere and probably has some sort of very strange origin story, or had to do with like how many siblings have a nickname based on like their older sibling didn't know how to pronounce their name or something like that. Like, but this is where you draw the line, is just making sure somebody feels disrespected every time you call them. Like, doesn't make sense, especially when you're talking about like a religion that's all about kindness and treating people with respect and love, but then you're like actively saying, I'm going to treat you in a very unloving way.
Yeah, all of the people that I've seen who become nuns or become priests, like they do purposefully take on a new name, so that they're no longer whatever their first name is. They're Father Simon so and so of the whatever, or Sister and insert a saint name. Like it's
Yeah.
core to that identity switch. And thinking on sort of a bigger note here, I talk to a lot of people who are starting to question their sexuality. They're looking at religion and begin thinking about deconstruction.
Mhm.
And I always tell people that like deconstruction isn't destruction, sort of to examine all these beliefs, to make those decisions about what is it that you want to believe. Um, and the big thing that scares them is that their identity and community and life advice and how they see the future is filtered through their group.
Mhm.
And once they start questioning these big things or having to make new decisions out there without like a guide to make every decision, it becomes very scary. Like I remember my own experience of leaving religion, having it taken away from me very quickly. And I just remember sort of floundering like this muscle of making life decisions I've never developed. I don't know what my identity is like. What should somebody do when they're in that in-between phase of starting to deconstruct religion and wanting an identity, but their only identity has been in the church? How does somebody form a healthy identity and go about that?
Well, I think when you're in that process of still figuring it out, which I don't think you really have an end to, right? Like I think we're
Yeah.
all still figuring it out forever. It is about letting yourself be really uncomfortable and building that distress tolerance, right? Like not in an unsafe way, right? I'm talking about discomfort, not lack of safety. And a lot of people mix those two up, right? If it doesn't feel comfortable, then we assume it's unsafe, and that's not necessarily the case, right? Like therapy, the whole thing that I do as a therapist is make people uncomfortable all day long and help them sit and build that tolerance up for it so that they can be uncomfortable, right? And when you've been given a very clear roadmap your whole life, you have not had to be really uncomfortable, right? You know exactly what to do to sit in that comfort and to do what you're supposed to do. And so, really building the ability physically, somatically in your body, but also mentally to say, like, okay, I'm really uncomfortable. I don't know what's next. And I'm going to allow that to be true. And I'm going to sit with it. And I'm going to just be uncomfortable and not try to find anything, a vice or whatever, to plug into its place, right? Like that can be really huge. I think a huge part of like work I do with people who come from, high demand, high control religious backgrounds is to completely start over in terms of building neurologically your critical thinking skills, right? You were supposed to learn those and have that part of your brain be developed much younger, but you were actively told not to. Don't critically think. That is against the faith. That means you have weak faith, right? And so a lot of deconstruction work has nothing to do with like deciding what's good and bad or what you believe, but just saying like, can you practice thinking critically about something?
Yeah. That was such a challenge for me. And, and I found it to be a weird experience because so much of my own religious background was learning this theology and the philosophy. And it's like this ornate edifice, this intellectual tradition, but it's much more about memorizing the axioms and memorizing the things. And then I remember leaving and looking at the big questions of life, and it was a weird feeling to like sit with a question and not have to grasp for an answer.
Yeah.
Right? Like, what is the purpose of life? To go from like I have an answer, and then go like, what if I don't have one? And like I now a few years later, I feel like I'm starting to develop that. But it was a very different shift to just go. I can have these uncomfortable feelings. I can question things. I don't have to have answers, and like that's okay. And like I don't have to have everything figured out. And even in the deconstruction process, where it's like, where's this going? Where it's like that's not even the right question to be asking because part of deconstruction is you don't know where you're going to end up.
Yeah.
And um,
I think that's the beauty of it, though, right? That you don't know, because even the roadmap you're given in religion is like, well, you're going to end up in one of two places, heaven or hell. Like, you figure it out. Um, but saying, there isn't necessarily an end that I know, and I'm not even thinking about it. I'm just going to focus on like, what do I want to do and how do I want to live in the present is pretty wonderful. Very scary, though. Very, very scary.
if you're sitting with a client who's starting to question religion or leave religion, what are some practical steps and exercises that they can do to start rebuilding their life?
There's definitely like that's a pretty complicated question and would involve a lot. It's going to depend more so like functionally on how integrated into their life it is, right? Because it's not often that you just have someone who's like a believer in something and then they have to work on how do they unbelieve it, right? More so it's like all of their relationships are tied on up in it. Their job might be tied up in it. Their finances might be tied up, and where they live might be tied up in it. Like for some people, it can be an entire life change in every single way. And so that has to be chipped at really slowly and carefully if you want to do that, or you decide what can you take and what can you leave, right? Like there are plenty of religions out there and churches out there and things like that who do things in healthier ways and don't traumatize people and actually try to live by their beliefs. And you don't have to throw all that away. If it's not hurting you and or somebody else, fantastic. Then, religion can be a fantastic coping skill mentally or emotionally for people when it's not hurting you or somebody else. But a lot of people forget the somebody else piece too, right? That it's not just like about you. You can't just go around hurting other people too. And so if I was to give like practical advice to somebody, it's just that it's going to be really slow work. It's going to take a lot of time. It's going to take a lot of patience and self-compassion towards yourself. It's going to take rebuilding new community, putting yourself out there, making yourself more comfortable, figuring out pieces of yourself, trying a lot of new things and seeing what sticks, what do you like, what do you not like, just kind of meeting yourself all over for the first time.
I remember as I was leaving, working with a therapist, and sort of a lot of the work was figuring out how much of my identity and world was religion, and then figuring out what's a sort of healthy alternative.
Yep.
Right? And sort of all of my friendships were in the church, and then those were yanked away. And it's like what are the practical steps? How do you make friends that you want? And I found like a great running community, or a sense of beauty or spirituality. It was like, oh, that was like a super great part of religion. And like, where's a healthier alternative to that, which was in a lot of hiking and spending time in nature,
Yeah.
or the like philosophy. I love just like learning.
Yeah.
And it was like, are there other books or concepts that I could learn instead? Is one thing that I sort of work through with a therapist on my own time. Is that something that you often work with clients on, sort of recognizing what religion like gets you, so to speak, and some healthy alternatives to that to rebuild?
Absolutely. And this one also becomes really difficult, and honestly has a lot to do with like privilege and location,
Hmm.
because there are many people in which where they live, the entire community is based around a church or religion, and they don't have an option, or financial means to just like find a running club. That running club is probably hosted by the
Yeah.
church, right? So it's like
Yeah.
that one's a hard one, right? And it really depends on where the person is and what means they have. I live in the Washington, D.C. area, and we are deeply blessed to have anything you can think of in terms of like a hobby, sport, whatever event. We have it here. Somebody is doing it, or you create your own, right? So in the spaces where maybe it doesn't already exist, you build your own thing and see how many other people are interested. And usually you'll find people. Luckily, we also are in a much more online life and world now. And so that's also an opportunity for people who, if they logistically can't find that community, can often find it somewhere online. Obviously you have to be careful there and all the safety measures, but it takes a lot of work. And I do think we all have to acknowledge like that there's a lot of privilege and resources. And that one of the things that a lot of church communities provide is resources. And there's a lot of value in that. And it can be really hard to turn away from that.
And speaking on online spaces, yeah, like you said, there's so many more niche online communities. Like I sort of
Yeah.
run a community of my own that people found helpful. There's so many different, whatever sort of identity you're working through and experience. Like there's so many great communities. What are some of the, actually, how do I want to phrase this question? What are some of the ways online communities can be helpful for people questioning religion and sexuality and gender? And what are some of the ways that finding those online communities might go a little too far or can be unhealthy?
Um, I think same as like, this kind of comes back to the question about like what makes religion traumatic or not, right? Like that there are religions and or religious settings that don't have to traumatize people. And so it really still comes back to people and how the people act and what that looks like inside of it. There are like, there is a really, really large group of like therapists who work with in religious trauma. And one of the most prominent religious trauma therapists is somebody who has just perpetuated more trauma, right? Like all they did in deconstructing was then put themselves in the place of God, and now everyone needs to look to them, right? Like they just recreated the pattern of what oppression looks like, and now they're in the figurehead spot versus God or a higher power. It happens all the time. So whether that's in online settings or in person, it's really about checking your ego, making sure you've done a lot of work, making sure you're recognizing when you meet people or run into people who haven't done that work or who are perpetuating those cycles, maybe, but just within a different way, right? Those oppressive systems can happen anywhere, whether you have religion or not. And they can certainly happen in the deconstruction world too.
As one of the things that I've found is that after somebody sort of they're questioning, they begin the deconstruction process. They're working through all these big things of, do I have to get a new job? Like for me, part of my career was involved in the church. It was like, I got to get a new job. For some people, it is leaving relationships. It's leaving communities behind. It's moving. All of these big things. And then in my own experience in talking to people, after you've gotten through those like really difficult sort of logistical and resource things, your body starts relaxing.
Mm-hmm.
And I've almost found there's a second wave that can hit and be really impactful when your body calms down. It knows that it's safe. And then all of this stuff sort of comes up from the dark that has been pushed because your body's been fight or flight.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, I've seen a number of people who've lost their lives going through that sort of secondary phase of processing. Is that something that you notice, a second wave of religious trauma after the body feels safe? And how should somebody navigate maybe that second stage, or maybe there's other stages that I'm not thinking about?
Sure. Yeah. I think of it less as a second stage and more as a rejection of this feeling of safety and calm. And what I mean by that is that, and this happens in any sort of traumatic upbringing, religious or not, or anything like that. Like even if you're in a relationship that's really violent or abusive and you get out of it, right? Like if your body, if your brain, if your emotions are used to one thing, whether that's fight or flight or whatever, and now suddenly you are in a place where you logically know you're calm and safe, your body usually doesn't know, right? Like your body's expecting the other shoe to drop. Your brain might know it, but your body is tensed and waiting. And when that other shoe doesn't drop, it's usually what happens is we reject the feeling of calmness, because calm, peace actually does not feel safe. It just feels like a precursor to the next trauma, to the next thing. And so a way that a lot of people will handle that in a maladaptive way is to self-sabotage, right? Or go towards a substance or a vice or something like that, where they can then, well, I know the other shoe's going to drop at some point, so I might as well throw the dynamite in myself, right? And so then they experience that unsettled feeling of like, something is wrong, but I don't know what. Honestly, a lot of the work there within like the trauma sphere is somatic safety, right? And somatic responses, and teaching your body to be safe. Because in those scenarios that you described, it's not that the body knows it's safe, it's that the mind knows it's safe and it has not told the body yet. And so it's a lot of somatic work of like actually teaching your nervous system how to regulate and feeling okay with that. And that is a really hard connection for most people.
That's such a fascinating way to look at it. Yeah, because I've been doing a series of interviews of survivors of conversion therapy. And when I was thinking through the second stage, that makes so much more sense on like, it's people that have either grown up with parents that are forcing this on them, or they've been preyed on by therapists, these like fake conversion therapists for years.
Yeah.
And once, that's sort of creating that connection to not feel like there's something bad that's coming.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that can really only be done in a therapeutic context, or what are some practical steps that somebody can do to help that feeling of like the other shoe's about to drop?
Mm-hmm.
How can somebody work on that both with a therapist and then as a sort of lifelong endeavor?
I mean, certainly my bias is always going to be towards therapy. I think everyone needs therapy and should be in therapy. I've been in therapy my whole adult life, and it's been game changer for me as a person, as a client, and then also obviously as my job. So certainly a therapist can help you, but again, it's got to be the right fit. It's got to be a therapist who knows about like mind-body connection and all of that. But in addition to therapy, really any sort of somatic or body work can be really helpful, right? So anything that makes you present in your body in that moment and not in a distracted way, right? Like some people might, play a sport and they'll be so wrapped up in the competition or something like that that they're not necessarily in their body, right? They're more in their brain. Whereas what I really want people to do is be physically in your body. Like you're playing soccer, you're physically thinking about, the fake grass under your cleats, right? And the feeling of the ball hitting your shoe and what that looks like, the feeling of the wind on your face, like really being in your body and spending as much time grounded in our body as possible. And so you can do that on your own through any sort of physical activity. You can do that through meditation, mindfulness exercises. Yoga is a really great way of forcing you to be in your body. Any sort of slow exercise is really helpful where you're really focused on like a position or how you're standing or how you're whatever. Those things can help you really get more connected with yourself in any sort of way, but also then like the connection of your body with other people, right? Practicing what it's like to trust other people with your body more, what it's like to hug somebody and really feel safe and lean into it. Not just a quick hug, but like hug somebody for like a full minute, like 1 minute long, without it leading to anything else, just like trust somebody else with your body. Or allowing someone to touch you in a vulnerable way where you're just focused on what does that touch feel like. There's a lot of really incredible ways that people can practice getting into their bodies and breath work and all of those things. And that helps with the nervous system regulation so much.
Tell me a little bit more about what are the signs and symptoms that somebody is self-sabotaging because of religious trauma. I was talking about sort of the big ones, which might actually involve vices or bigger things that are out there. But what are some of the little things that somebody can notice and think, yeah, maybe I am self-sabotaging here because my body is expecting the other shoe to drop, so to speak?
Sure. Well, this can look really varied, right, per person. And the complex part of religious trauma is that it so often overlaps a lot of other traumas because like your family's involved, your life is involved, there could be finances involved. So you could be experiencing, relationship trauma on top of it, financial trauma. You could be experiencing a lot of different types of trauma that all fall within that umbrella. So it gets more complicated when you think about it in that way. Obviously anything that feels out of control to you, is something to steer away from or work on. But a big piece would probably be focusing on like distorted thinking or cognitive distortions. And what that could look like, there's tons, but the more you're able to recognize that you're doing it, the biggest one in religion, obviously being black and white thinking or all or nothing thinking, like it has to be this way or it has to be that way. But there are all kinds of other sorts of distorted thoughts that we have every day. And religion promotes a lot of them, right? Like, so should statements. Anytime you hear yourself say the word should, you need to ask yourself, well, who said I should? Why should I, right? Therapists, we call it like shoulding all over yourself. Like, just don't do it, right? Or like fortune telling, right? Where you predict, I know XYZ is going to happen, or you don't really know. Or mind reading, where you're like, I think everybody here is thinking about me, or oh my gosh, they must think I'm terrible, or whatever that is, right? Any of those distorted thinkings usually end up with some sort of self-sabotage behavior because it's not based in reality to begin with. And so when we're having a distorted thought, it feels really scary. And so often people will go to something that just feels comforting. And the things that feel comforting to us aren't necessarily the healthiest things, right? It might be like that extra wine at dinner, or it might be a relationship that is actually hurting you in the long run, but feels really good right now, or, on and on and on it goes.
As you're talking about this, I'm having this sort of epiphany of going through and working with my own therapist, which to the audience, like, especially through these difficult things, absolutely find a therapist. And like you said, somebody who connects well. And I've told people in some interviews that the biggest thing that my therapist taught me is that, like, to get me to live in my body again. And she didn't ever say that explicitly. And now, as you're sort of saying, like, that's a technique, I'm like, it turns out that that she had education in all of this, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
like there is, especially in my own experience of Catholicism, which is very intellectual. You're thinking out there. There's all these big rules around how God works and what He can hear and how life works. And her pushing me to just to be able to say I feel and to be able to just share that without like filtering like how is it that one can think about this or like what is the truth statement to just breathe and like I can say what I'm feeling. And at that point I was still trying to figure out religion and like I can be honest with what I'm thinking and I can breathe and whatever God might be out there as I was rethinking all of that, He can at least have me be honest was like this
Yeah.
big epiphany and being able to think through and connect with my body because so much of my experience was spent thinking through these big problems to avoid having to like deal with the whole heart thing and the emotions. It was like intellectualize my way out of feeling emotions that I felt like I couldn't have.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
it's
that's
a
also
great
why queerness is so dangerous to religion, right? The entire
Mhm.
concept of queerness is I'm focusing on what my body looks like how I want to present to the world and or how I want to touch someone else's body. Like, right?
Mhm.
The whole concept of queerness is being grounded in your body of saying this is who I am and this is how I want my body to be perceived, whether it's gender or something like that, and or how I want my body to interact with somebody else's body. Very dangerous to religion.
And as people are working through, sort of, we've gone through questioning, looking at deconstruction, some of the longer tail stuff. Um, One of the things that I hear about leaving religion is that people often feel stuck or behind in life or entering their teenage phase again, but much later in life. Or
Mhm.
people come out at 50 and it's like, I've felt like I've thrown away this portion of my life, or I feel like I've lost my career or relationship or job because I left religion, or I'm coming out, whatever it is. Um, how should somebody think through and deal with these emotions of feeling behind in life, not good enough in life? That, yeah, they've spent so long in this group, I might as well just keep going. Like, or I feel like I'm a kid again and I don't know how to go on dates for the first time. How should somebody deal with all of that?
Yeah, that sunk cost fallacy is really hard to move away from of like, oh, I spent so much time here. What's the point of leaving? What I tell people, at least when we're talking about it from a religious lens, is like, look how many other areas of the world that happens all the time, right? Like somebody might be in a career for a very long time and then either the career ends for whatever reason or they no longer are interested and they have to redefine themselves through their career, right? Or what if somebody's in a marriage for a very long time and then they get divorced or their spouse dies and then they have to start over, right? Or some other identity shift happens. Like statistically, those very large identity shifts happen at least 4 to 5 times in somebody's lifetime, whether it's through a job, a relationship, a location, a move, whatever. We have to start over many, many times in our life, and that's not uncommon and it's scary and it feels like a lot, but it's a chapter, right? It's a new chapter, and every chapter you get a fresh start. However, the thing I tell people that hopefully makes it a little less scary is that, you're never starting at zero. You're always, it's a building block, right? It's a brand new block, a brand new step, a brand new chapter, but it is still built on the foundation of the last ones. And so you're never starting at zero. But you do get to start again, and how wonderful that is in so many ways, right? Like I can't imagine a world in which I'm just like, oh, I'm going to be doing this and only this for the next 50 years and that is it. Like most humans are not satisfied with that. None of us usually are. We all like to have some newness, some variety, right? The key to a lot of like genuine life joy is variety and novelty. Those two things are required in our life to feel joy.
How can someone grieve the years that they feel like they've lost or were taken from them from either high demand religion and or being in the closet?
Yeah, that's really painful. It's a lot of grief work that, we can work towards desensitizing a bit, but it doesn't go away, right? It's not going to be like you're ever going to go back and be like, I'm so happy that happened. You can pull bits and pieces from it that, well, I gained this from it. This was how I got to here, right? Like I love where I am now and I wouldn't have gotten here if it wasn't for that. Like you can do some stuff there, but it doesn't necessarily make that feel so much better. It does still kind of come back to the groundedness of the moment, right? Of like staying in your body right now, of like you can't change what you didn't know, what you didn't have back then. What you can do is what you have right now and what you have going forward. And that is where if we can keep more of our focus there, it does help a lot. In terms of like lost time, usually that still ends up being more of an intellectual exercise, right? The whole concept of lost time, because we don't know. Any of us could get hit by a bus tomorrow and then you just lost the next 50 years, right? Like, what does that mean? None of us are guaranteed anything. And so thinking of like, how does that chapter impact your journey and what can you kind of glean from it going forward? But really saying like, I'm here right now. What do I want to do now?
After I left religion, I'm glad that I sort of took like a year or two off of thinking about religion before beginning my own content, sort of on the internet. One thing that I found that even sometimes I fall into now, or that I've seen some people immediately leave religion and they channel sort of these feelings of grief or anger or wanting to get back at the institution into activism or into spending time online trying to tear down these things. Or in my case, sometimes I'm like, am I making content to help people or am I making like it to get back at something? How can someone deal with the anger against their formal religious group in a healthy way? Without sort of immediately switching and wanting to burn something down. Yeah, how can somebody deal with anger after leaving religion?
I think people need the burn down phase. Like, I think there's nothing wrong with that as long as you allow it to be like a phase, right? You don't want the burn down phase to become a new identity. It's okay to embrace it and use that going forward in whatever manner that it looks like. It's not that you have to stop burning things down, but you have to find identities that are more fully whole in all kinds of ways and not just on one focus, right? Like you can have a cause, you can have something you're really important that's really important to you, but you need fullness in your life, right? Like obviously this topic is very important to me. Being a therapist is very important to me, but when I clock out at the end of the day, I'm also going home, right? I'm also a parent and I'm a friend, and those relationships are more important to me than anything else. And I think the more we ground our life and our happiness and our identities and relationships, the better we are. So while causes are wonderful and we need activists, we need people who are willing to put themselves out there and say the hard things, we also still need to go home and have relationships and have those be what really truly fulfills us. So I think there's nothing wrong with giving ourselves the phase if we need that. And I think it's incredible work to be an activist and to work hard, but to also make sure you have balance and know how to fill yourself up in other ways. You know, when I wrote the book, it's called Healing Sacred Wounds, and it comes out spring 2026 from Bloomsbury Publishing. It took me like 4 years to get it picked up, right? I've already written 30 plus other books, but this book particularly took me a very long time to get a publisher to buy it because like the feedback I kept getting was religious trauma isn't even a thing, right? And so that was pretty infuriating because like, what do you mean? Yes, it is. I lived it. I have it. So it absolutely is. But finally, you know, when Bloomsbury agreed to buy it and, you know, now they're publishing it, it's a big part of my life. I talk about it a lot. I work with it a lot. But I don't go home and I don't think about it at home, right? At home, I'm focused on what I really enjoy, like what hobbies do I like and what television show am I watching right now and things that fill up my cup in other ways too. And so I just think that that variety continues to just be so important.
I've found the big thing that's changed in my own life since leaving is that I'm okay having different hats, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
That my career, I can have that as part of my life and also doesn't have to be all of it. And I can also have hobbies and these other identities. I've always struggled with like being a very all in or all out type of guy, and trying to balance that. It was the big thing after leaving religion that it's like, oh, I can have identities like hats that I'm putting on throughout the days or throughout the months, and they're all part of me, but they don't have to be all of me. And it's okay to clock out in the same way that we do from a job. You can clock out, and I've talked with a lot of long distance runners, which is a lot of the things that I do, and they can never taken off season because like that's their only hat. I'm like, that's what winter's for. I don't want to be running in the snow. Like I can that can be part of my identity, and also part of the year like isn't. Was like this big epiphany for me that like not every identity has to be everything. Like identity is malleable and changeable.
That's where that like fighting that black and white thinking comes in, right? That you can be more in the gray of like, yeah, both and like we can have all of these things. We don't have to pick one.
And now that we've talked through sort of this trajectory as people are deconstructing, finding their own queer identity, I want to talk a little bit about how one can dip their toes in the waters, let's say, of queer experience, of queer spaces, of queer identity. Where often, at least in my own experience of Catholicism, was like when you're in the church, you're told that the queer community is a certain set of things out there. It's the crazy clubs and it's promiscuous pride parades, and it's either be Catholic and never acknowledge this, or it's that.
Yeah.
And when I found in my own experience, it was like, there's a lot of diversity in queer spaces, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with going to the clubs, and I love going now. When I was first coming out, it's like, sometimes it's a running group, it's a chess club. How can someone, as they're exploring their own queer identity, slowly make their way into queer spaces that are healthy, that are safe, that they feel comfortable in, that they can explore?
Yeah.
What are some practical steps or things to be aware of when somebody wants to introduce themselves to the queer community, so to speak?
I think it still kind of, I guess I keep coming back to the concept of variety, right? Like of trying all of it, right? I have my group of gay friends who I know if it's 2 a.m. and I want to go out, they're out somewhere and I can find them out. But I also have like the group of gay friends who are like, yeah, we're in bed by 10. It's going to be that
Yes.
way. And you need both. Like you definitely need both, right? And I have the group of friends who's like into sports or whatever. If I want this, if I have a craft question, I know it's these people who I can ask, right? If I need a family, like queer family, I know the parents who are in that world and what that looks like, right? It is about, not a lot of people have one group of friends and that's it, right? Like allowing yourself to have multiple pots of friends. Like you may have one or two like really, really close, intimate friends, but when it comes to circles and communities, like allow yourself to be part of many, like have your foot in the door at a lot of different places that then, in combination of all of those places is really fulfilling to who you are in multifaceted ways.
I love that. And I think that relates to sort of same thing with identities, where in a religious space, like all of your friends in your community and your hobbies and your identity and oftentimes your job are like in this one place.
Wow.
And like in my case, when it was sort of ripped away, it was like, I got to find that all into one other place, versus it sounds like sort of what you're laying out here as one's rebuilding their life is to have multiple different friend groups of unrelated things,
Mhm.
and not all or nothing. And with identities and hobbies is to be a sort of multifaceted person where people know you, like not to be dishonest, but like you don't have to have all of the same friends from all of the same place or identities. You can
Mhm.
have those different groups that do different things. It sort of sounds like the vision that you're kind of laying out for people.
It is, and it's usually very hard to feel comfortable with that, right? Because we are usually taught, especially in high demand, high control religions, that this one group is going to satisfy and meet every need that you have. You shouldn't have any needs outside of this one group. And therefore, to become comfortable with, okay, I actually do have needs that like one group of friends can't possibly meet is very difficult within oneself. It's also, religion permeates our culture in America very intensely, right? So, like, we also get that message just from the media, right? Like, you see television shows where they have like their three best friends and they have coffee together every day, and somehow they don't, I don't know, do they go to a job or something? They have plenty of time to sit on that orange couch, right? And we're told like it should look like that, right? You should have your best friend who's your ride or die, and that should be your lifelong best friend. Where in reality, very few people ever have that, right? You go through seasons where you have someone where you're close to for a while, and then they move or their life circumstance change, and you kind of drift and you find a new person, and like that's normal and that's how it's supposed to be. Really, is that variety? But we are so told, whether in religious settings or even just like in our culture, that no, you're supposed to have like specific group that meets every need that you have. You're supposed to have one single romantic partner who meets every single need that you have, and that's life. And so then everyone ends up feeling like, well, I failed because I can't do it.
I remember when I was starting to explore that, I almost felt guilty that,
Mm.
like in a religious context, you're supposed to be the same person at all times and all places, no matter where you are. Like, there's a social script,
Mhm.
and like I have my business and sort of like professional personality.
Yep.
And if I'm going out to the clubs or to the pride parades, like it's different. And then if I just have my friends that I love to do videography with and take photos with, I remember almost feeling guilty that like
Yeah.
people knew me as sort of different angles. I wasn't like completely code switching, but it was this like, oh my gosh, like I felt guilty because I was sort of a
Yeah.
different person between all of those spaces.
Yeah.
Is that something that often comes up in conversations around religious trauma?
For sure. Yeah. Like you are supposed to be one person, and what that means is, I mean, it's impossible to define. Like wouldn't know how anyone could define themselves as one thing or one person. And it certainly comes up a lot. I think it comes up in plenty of non-religious ways. I've definitely like, I think anytime, not every anytime, but there are several times like I've broken up with a woman and she's been like, I can't believe a therapist would do this. And I'm like, I am not your therapist. I was your girlfriend and now I'm not. Okay. Like that comes up a lot where you get like, if you're outside of the therapist role and you're not in this chair, they're like, yeah, aren't you supposed to be a therapist? I'm like, no, not right now. I'm dancing in the club. Thank you very much. Like, leave me be. And both of them are authentic pieces of me, but it's like, different people bring out different sides of me, different settings and locations bring out different parts of me, different circumstances bring out different parts of me. And like, I love the fullness of that. Like, that is so meaningful to me. I hate the phrase like living your best life. I much prefer like the concept of living a full life. And a full life involves your worst too. And that is required to enjoy the best. And so I just love all of it, the fullness of emotional spectrum that we get to go and experience. And I would never want my entire life to be sitting in a chair just listening to other people's emotions, right? I want to have them too.
And the last big topic that I wanted to hit is on sexuality. And a lot of these conversations around religious trauma, um, especially in high demand experiences of Catholicism, sexuality and shame and purity culture are a huge thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then when people are both then exploring queer identity on top of it, throws people for a loop. And then obviously especially on sexuality, like if you're listening in the audience, like find a good therapist because everybody's journey on sexuality, especially in shame, is going to be very different. But speaking in broad strokes, how can somebody who's experiencing religious trauma and sexual shame begin to healthily explore these ideas around sexuality without going extreme and causing more shame, and also not staying stagnant and letting religion completely control them? Yeah, how can, and maybe there's like four other questions that are sort of baked into this one big question, which is how can someone start exploring these ideas around sexuality in a healthy and authentic way?
I think I'd actually even maybe just push back on the question of like,
Okay.
of maybe you don't. Maybe you try some unhealthy ways first and you just ping pong around and figure it out, right? A lot of people, when they're making big life changes and you have lived on like one side of the spectrum for so long, you do kind of have to swing real far to the other side in order to come back to the middle. And as long as there's no like massive long-term consequences, it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to do unhealthy things and, explore that, right? Like, let's say you were in a relationship for a really long time and then afterwards you're like, I need a hoe phase. Like, go for it. Eventually you'll calm down. That's fine. Like, be safe, use protection, all that. But like, still, okay, maybe you need to swing to the other side of the pendulum for a while and not shame yourself for it, right? Maybe you don't know what it looks like to do it in a healthy way. Maybe you know you're going to make mistakes and just allow yourself to do so, right? Like, try to keep things as safe as possible and have supports who are going to help boundary you in so you don't go like completely off the deep end. But like, as long as it's safe and you're not really hurting anybody, like, yeah, swing to the other side, have a hoe phase.
Yeah, that's it is a great piece of advice because I think so much of Catholicism, at least in my experience and so many people in my own community, is it's either complete purity and sexuality is only for a long-term relationship and for marriage. And I was actually just talking to a friend last night and trying to explain to him that like if you want to go on dates with other guys for the first time, it doesn't mean that like you're about to get married. Because he was like, oh, dating a guy would be such an upheaval in my life and I wouldn't know what to do with that. I was like, no, like going on dates for the first time doesn't mean dating,
Yeah.
like somebody in particular. That it's okay to get out there, and also the big thing that I experienced now after having left Catholicism and then I was in a 2-year relationship is now it's like dating can just be a fun thing and a social activity, a sort of recreational thing, so to speak, where I'm not looking for marriage on the table. That you can go on dates and have fun and not know the social scripts and
Yeah,
make mistakes and figure things out and not have to have a plan
exactly.
when you approach the topic of sexuality.
Yeah. I fully agree. We don't need to have a plan. We don't need to know anything. We can just get out there and try. The only thing we do have to do is be transparent about that with other people, right?
Yeah.
And as long as you're saying that, it's
hmm
fantastic.
How can someone deal with sexual shame especially if it's compounded with religious trauma?
I mean, that one is a lot harder to unpack, and I would probably talk to a therapist about that one. Specifically, like sex therapy is really, really helpful. It depends how like deeply rooted the sexual shame is, right? Because for some people, sexual shame can literally show up physically, somatically, right? Like the inability to have an orgasm because you're so afraid to find pleasure in that act, right? Or you're so disconnected from your body, you don't even know how an orgasm would feel or how to get there, right? And a lot of people think, oh, you just meet the right person or whatever. No, no, no. Like trauma is very rooted in the body. And so like sex therapy can really help with you, again, becoming more grounded in your body. And that's going to be a lot, of any sort of trauma healing is getting more in your body. And so that includes sexually, but it's also saying, that you get to decide that for yourself, right? Like, for example, what if you're just somebody who's not very sexual? What if you're just asexual and that's just not a big deal for you? Nothing wrong with that. Accept it. That's perfectly fine, right? So some people, they want to explore more. Some people, they don't. That's something I would definitely I would talk to a sex therapist or your therapist about. Any therapist can help a little bit. And if they feel out of their depths, they can refer you to a sex therapist. But that aspect really has to do about the tie to your body, right? Especially for, not to stereotype, but for a lot of women, I've definitely seen a lot of women post religion, but also even still in religion, very much struggle with being able to find pleasure sexually, right? Because they spent so long saying, don't do that. That's sinful. Don't do that. Then they get married and you're on your wedding night and you're like, oh, now you're supposed to suddenly be able to do anything you'd see a porn star do. And it's like, whoa, 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 whoa. My body cannot make that adjustment like that.
I've also found that oftentimes dealing with religious shame, people say this is a sign from God, but recognizing that sexual shame is instilled and it's natural, and if you're experiencing it, it can be the fact that that was instilled in you externally,
Mhm.
and to feel that doesn't necessarily mean any message from God. It doesn't mean you're doing something wrong, and even after having left religion, that can still be there, and you can recognize that and deal with it, and it in a certain sense, your reaction doesn't always dictate how you have to act or how you have to think about it. It's this is a thing, and now I get to decide what I want to do with that. Is at least my approach, and maybe there's sort of an angle that I'm missing there, but that's one of the ways that I tend to think about it.
I definitely agree with that. I mean, I think if you just look up the definition of shame, right, it's a belief of an inherent lack of worth as a person and an inherent lack of being loved or being lovable, right? And so if you are saying this is a sign from God, that your shame is a sign from God, what religion are you following? What religion is yeah, God is telling you you're unlovable? What? I'd have some questions.
And as we sort of wrap up here, we've sort of given an outline of maybe some helpful steps that somebody can think through at different stages in their journey. The one thing that I've found as I get in my own journey further and further away from religion, there's times where I think back, and I'm like, am I remembering that correctly? Or sometimes things can have a rose-colored glasses. Sometimes they can have worse glasses. And the nice thing, sort of the work now that I do is I get to see these spaces that I was in. I'm like, oh, it was what I was thinking. But a common experience as people get further and further away is I miss this community. Even though I've left and there are so many reasons that I've left, we're talking about shoulding all over oneself.
Mm-hmm.
if I've left, I shouldn't miss parts of it,
Right.
or that I should never want to go back.
Yeah.
Thinking long term as those creep up over the years, how should someone see those emotions and deal with missing a place that they don't want to go back to?
Well, I mean, I would just point out how often that happens in a million different ways, right? Like a lot of us can think back to a job we quit and remember wonderful things that we loved at that job, but we don't want to go back, right? Or like, oh my gosh, I really loved doing XYZ job, but they paid $12 an hour and I can't make a living on that, right? Like we all have reasons that we choose to leave things, whether it's a relationship or whatever. Just because you miss it, just because you have feelings for it, positive or whatever, doesn't mean that's what you want, right? It's also, I'm a couples therapist. I work with couples all the time, and people are like, but we love each other. And I'm like, that is not enough, right? Do you want the same things? Do you want the same life? Are you talking to each other in kind ways, right? Like, so if you think back to a relationship and you're like, oh, well, I really loved them. Okay, but did you have all the other things that make a lifelong relationship actually sustainable? It's wonderful, but did it actually matter or meet what you want to begin with? And if that answer is no, then it's totally okay to miss it, to love it, to think about the positive pieces, but just say, still not aligned with what I want for myself right now.
Yeah, it's a question that I often get asked in interviews, and I say like, yeah, there's parts that I miss, but I'm still glad of the decision that I've made.
Sure.
That it doesn't mean everything's bad. And sort of the final question here is that both talking to people who've been out longer than I have, and in my own experience in the first few years, there's times where it's like, oh, I'm over this trauma response,
Yeah.
and then something will randomly pop up or get under my skin. I'm like, oh, this is sort of a lifelong journey. It never like goes away. There certainly is hope that like I'm very proud of my life now and very happy, and like religious trauma doesn't play a big part. But I also know that like this will be part of my story going forward.
Mm-hmm.
How do you set realistic expectations with clients of we're both healing and growing, and also this is sort of a lifelong experience? How do you thread that needle?
Well, I thread the needle by the definition of trauma, right? Of if you are somebody who is currently experiencing trauma or you are struggling with trauma, it is dysfunctional in some way in your life. And that is the part that in therapy and in healthy spaces we want to work through and help. We're not going to change that it feels bad, that it's a terrible memory or it was a hard time in your life or any of those things. That can't be changed because that's what happened. But what we can do is change or desensitize it in order for it not to be dysfunctional anymore. And so what that means in terms of like function can be like cognitively, like you're no longer beating yourself up about it. So you're not telling yourself you're a terrible person when you think of it. You're not depressed after having that interaction with somebody or suddenly going to some sort of other extreme emotion. You're sleeping through the night and not having nightmares about it. You're able to hold down a job. You're able to have relationships, right? Like if it is negatively impacting something in your life, whether it's functional, relationship, affective, your affect, your cognitive, whatever, that's something we can work on, and that's something we can help the trauma not impact. But it doesn't change that it happened and that there are going to be reminders of it that don't feel good. But if that reminder is just uncomfortable and sad or an emotional state, that's just human. That's normal. If that reminder paralyzes you for 2 days, we need to work on that, right? But yeah, being upset and sad and triggered is human.
It has been an absolute blast having you on. There's sort of two things that I want the audience to hear about is sort of your own therapy practice, and then the book. If you could first give us a quick promo. If somebody's listening, they're thinking through all of these things, why should they go see a therapist, whatever, in their local area? And then tell us a little bit about the work that you do if somebody is in a service area that you provide with.
Yeah. So we are LGBT plus counseling collaborative in the Washington, D.C. area. We do serve nationally, but we mostly primarily stick with Maryland, Washington, D.C., and Virginia. Our website is lgbtcounselingdmv.com. There are a lot of networks of really great religious trauma therapists throughout the country, though. If you go to Empathy Paradigm, they have a directory of religious trauma therapists that's really fantastic, and I would recommend people look there. I think it's really important to find a therapist that you connect with, and that might mean trying a couple different ones before you actually find a fit. So definitely don't give up, but it's really, really important.
Yeah, and there's so much self-help that one can do on the internet.
Yeah.
In reading other books, I found in my own experience, I was 20 at the time, there was a local nonprofit that subsidized for youth and for LGBT individuals to get some amount of free therapy. And that was like life changing to have an expert be able to read body language and
Yep.
think through these was, yeah, if somebody's listening, find a good therapist. It might take finding and looking around a few times, but that work is invaluable. And there are different ways to sort of some different community grants. But go on that journey. You will not regret it. And then tell us a little bit about the book. Somebody is listened to an hour and 15 minutes of us talking. Tell us about that book, how it's going to help, where they can find it, and some of the other resources that you have.
Sure. Right now, the working title is Healing Sacred Wounds. And so I'm pretty sure that'll be the title going forward, but we're still in the edit stage. But it'll come out next spring 2026. And anyone who wants to kind of keep up to date with that, you can go to our website. There's a tab for books or joining the newsletter. So lgbtcounselingdmv.com/books. And so, you can follow when it comes out or when it's available for pre-order there. You can also follow me on Instagram at SC Neely, Nealy, and I post about it there pretty often. So you can also chat there.
Thank you so much for being on. I've had a few epiphanies of my own. I've been wanting to have this sort of concept to point people to, because this is a super important conversation. Somebody with your own expertise has been incredibly valuable for everybody listening. I can't thank you enough for spending your time with us and helping people in my own audience.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.